Hi, Callie. How's it going?
Kyla, it's great to be here. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics and what I think is, the most important topic that we could talk about right now, which of course is housing. And you just published this fantastic piece on housing and what it looks like and kind of where we're headed and where we've been. And so I do want to back up with this first question and talk about how we got here with housing, where this demand is coming from, why there's a supply misbalance, and sort of the factors that have led to the housing crisis that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, well, how much time do you have? This might take a while.
I know.
Well, yeah, it's really something that started around the financial crisis, and part of it was destiny. And I'll get to that in a second. But the easiest summary I can make of what's happened in the housing market is, we had this terrible financial crisis back in the mid 2000s. It obviously affected the housing market. We had a lot of Americans that really overextended on mortgages that they could afford and, just general, budgets and affordability in the mid 2000s. And that came crashing down in a big way. There was a wave of mortgage defaults. There were a lot of, homes left empty, homes foreclosed on. And look, it basically, like, the economy crashed because of, too much heat in the housing market, too much demand in the housing market. So the pendulum swung in the other direction, Kyla. And ever since then, we've seen a shortage of housing. We've seen builders not being able to build, not having the capacity to build. And at the same time, we've seen the largest generation alive, the millennials, come in and hit their 30s and start, moving in together, getting married, wanting to start families. And wanting to buy houses too. So it's really been this imbalance of supply and demand, Kyla. And the tough part now is that after the Fed has hiked rates, mortgage rates are very high. Demand is still quite high, quite high in the way that prices haven't come down. And supply just hasn't seemed to pick up for a number of reasons.
Yeah. And, a large portion of your piece was focused on the Federal Reserve has finally cut rates. It's the moment everyone's been waiting for. They cut rates by 50 basis points, but you're like, hey, that might not be enough. Like, mortgage rates will go down, but this is maybe not going to save everybody. And so could you talk to that point, like the affordability crisis that's exacerbated by high mortgage rates? And even though the Fed's trying to fix it, hypothetically, it's not working.
Well, I'm trying to be as hopeful as ever, Kyla, because like I said, I'm a millennial and, right now my husband and I own a house, but we're in the Charlotte housing market. And, if we wanted to move, we probably would have a hard time right now because, things are quite expensive and we're one of the lucky millennials that has a house. But part of the reason why housing is so expensive right now is because if you're like me, you're going to have to borrow money to buy a house, and it costs a lot of money to borrow money. It costs a lot of money to take out a loan, take out a mortgage to buy a house. It costs less money than it did, say 3 months ago because the Fed has started cutting rates, and those rate cuts have, matriculated through the bond market and led to lower mortgage rates. So housing is slightly cheaper, but prices and mortgage rates have gone up so much over the past 4 years that housing isn't even close to affordable. And, I ran a little bit of napkin math in my latest post. And, if things stay okay in the economy, if, people remain employed, if companies keep hiring, then that's the best case scenario you could ask for. But it could lead to the Fed not cutting rates as much. And that could lead to mortgage rates that stay pretty high compared to what we were used to in the 2010s.
Yeah, that golden 2% mortgage. If you got in with that, you're considered quite lucky. And people like me who did not get that are a little bit worried. And when we look at home prices, as you talked about when you were talking about the answer to the first question, a lot of it is a misbalance between supply and demand. And so is the way that we fix home prices just really building more homes? Like, is it that simple?
I think if you wanted to boil it down, that's what needs to be fixed. And I say that because I don't think demand is going to come down anytime soon. We all know how people talk about the American dream of buying a house. There's like this, there's almost this fetish around owning a house where people see it as their path to wealth and success. So there's already that drive to buy a house. It seems like whenever you hit a certain age, people are like punching you in the ribs, telling you to go ahead and, start, stop throwing money away. And by the way, I don't believe that, but stop throwing your money away and to, buy a house and build up that equity. And the largest generation alive, the millennials, are at the point where they're hitting that age and they're buying a lot of houses. So that's already, a huge wave of demand that the housing market needs to soak up. We haven't even gotten into the fact that there have been so many moves in and out of cities due to COVID and the fact that it's easier to work from home nowadays. And on the other side, you have supply. And like I mentioned earlier, supply has been quite low, especially for the amount of people who are looking to buy a house. But millennials are going to keep shacking up. They're going to keep starting families. They're going to keep looking for houses. You can't stop that. You have to fix the supply side of the equation.
Mm-hmm. And there's, of course, been like government policy proposals. Kamala Harris has proposed building 3 million more homes. And so it really seems like the two main solutions that we have are government intervention and Fed policy. Do you agree that those are really the only two paths out of the housing crisis? Like there's no free market that could come in and fix this? Is it that distorted?
I would say that there might be this crazy third option that none of us are thinking about. We have the smartest minds in the world here in America. Maybe there's this magical solution that we'll stumble upon. But for now, it does look like the only two options are government intervention and the government intervention being, all the ways that the government can, help home buyers or help incentivize, home builders to build houses. I think that that's a pretty wide bucket. But yeah, on the other side, you have the Fed, tweaking interest rates. And while the Fed's policy rate doesn't directly feed into mortgage prices, the Fed has a lot of sway around how the bond market sees interest rates. And ultimately, mortgages are priced off of longer term rates. The problem is when the Fed is trying to balance unemployment and inflation, that's its job. That's the dual mandate. It has to think about where the job market is relative to where prices are. And I'm not just talking about home prices. I'm talking about prices across the entire economy. And right now, they've gotten the victory over inflation. Inflation is under control. Prices are growing at a gradual pace now. So the Fed is happy with that. And the job market is weakening, still in an okay state, but it's not quite at the point where the Fed is going to drastically lower its policy rate, which could lead to rates falling across the board. And that's a good thing, right? That means that companies are still hiring and, most people are still employed. But the trade-off you have with that is that rates are probably not going to come down as much as people think. And that could mean that mortgage rates could stay around 5 to 6% for a while.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the situation that we'll end up in. It seems like everything's sort of pointing to that direction. And Connor Sen, who's over at Bloomberg Opinion, has this idea that, the American dream is no longer home ownership. And that's why we've seen the increase in things like speculation in crypto, sports gambling. So if people aren't building their net worth in housing, they're going towards, these more risky bets. Is that something that you agree with? Like, do you think because it seems like mortgage rates aren't coming down, home prices aren't coming down, that people are seeking out alternatives to the American dream?
Yeah, I think Connor's onto something there. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Well, I mean, first of all, I understand why people see the American dream as home ownership. It's been fetishized for decades now. And you know what? Owning a home is great, but it's not that dream that people cook it up to be. It's nice to have your own space, but I feel like the argument of renting versus buying is always seen as this, if you rent, you throw money away, but if you're buying, you're actually investing in your future self. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, if you own a home, you're spending a ton of money on maintenance. You're spending a ton of money on interest. You're spending a ton of money on HOA fees. I know that one for sure. And, if you're renting, you get the optionality of, being able to move for your career, being able to move for your own interests. So in the beginning, I think it's good that we're kind of deconstructing homeownership as the American dream. And I mean, today with investors having so many choices, it's great that they're able to define their own dreams. And it's great that they feel like they have the flexibility to look outside homeownership. I think that this is a really big dynamic these days, and it's not all good, but I think it's the product of a lot of different things, Kyla. I'm not so sure it's just the product of high home prices. I think if you had to sum it up, I think Americans are at a point where they have enough tools to define their own dreams, and they don't feel like they have to walk down the road of their parents.
Can you say more about that? So you're saying like people are looking around and they're like, okay, I don't have to have like the white picket fence. Instead, I can, figure out how to build wealth in a completely different way that is non-traditional, and that's totally okay. Like, do you think this generation is more ready to take on risk? Is that what you would call it?
I think that there are two sides to that coin, Kyla. So I definitely think there's an element of that. I think there are younger Americans who do look around and they say, I have access to public, I have access to online brokerages. I mean, heck, I can invest in alts now. There are plenty of ways to invest in like the newest like Michael Jordan shoe drop, the Jordan shoe drop. And I think that's a good thing. If you have more options to build your wealth, that's a good thing for everybody. I do think that there's a more pernicious side of it. I mean, obviously, home ownership is becoming more and more out of reach. And housing is our most basic need. So, you don't want housing costs to, get so out of control that people feel like they can't have a roof over their heads. But I think it's dynamic, right? I think the fact that we have so many options at our fingertips is a good thing. And, our parents, I mean, I can say because I'm a millennial, my parents certainly didn't have as many options as I did. I mean, I'm 33 and they were in their 30s in the early 90s. And that was before, online investing was a thing. That was before the internet was really a thing. So, I think it's just this big dynamic that we have to think about. And it's filled with a bunch of pros and cons. Overall, I think it's a good thing, but I certainly don't think the home ownership side and the cost of housing side is a good product of what's happened.
Excuse me. And when you say good product, do you mean like it's just not a good thing that home prices have gone up so much? Is that what you mean with regards to that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I'm not just talking about home prices there. I mean, home prices are certainly expensive, but rent inflation has been some of the more scorching part of rent prices have gone up a lot as well. So, I think generally, that's not a good dynamic for anybody in the American society. We need to be able to afford a roof over our heads. And that's why we've seen an uptick in homelessness, especially across urban areas. I mean, it's really sad. And if we're just talking about housing in general, how the housing affordability crisis is something we need to fix. I do think that's another side of the coin. And I think that relates to, what you mentioned a few minutes earlier around younger Americans seeing that they're not going to build their wealth through their, primary home and being able to look elsewhere to, start building their wealth, start investing. So again, good and bad things. I think the global financial crisis changed a lot of our psychological DNA around money and investing and, how to build that American dream.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because the people who are aging into housing right now, like I was 10 when the GFC happened. And so a lot of people who are experiencing the housing crisis firsthand don't have that background and like why housing is such a tenuous thing. And so I think that sort of distorts sentiment around it in a way that's pretty hard to reconcile. But with all that being said, are there any reasons to be optimistic about what we've been talking about? It sounds like you're pretty optimistic about the other opportunities to build wealth. But like when you look at the housing situation that we have on our hands, how are you finding optimism within all of this?
Yeah, well, first I want to bring up an interesting point that you raised in your in your last comment, Kyla. The people who are buying houses today are also the Americans who were in their early 20s, in their teens during the global financial crisis. And think about that for a second. I mean, I was in high school, for example, during the global financial crisis. Both of my parents lost their jobs. Thank God we didn't lose our house. But I felt the global financial crisis, and I knew that there was a connection to housing. It was obvious even if I wasn't an investor or a homeowner. But these same Americans are the ones now who are starting families, who are, looking for more space. And yeah, many of them are turning to housing. But if you think about it, I mean, millennials and younger Americans have been scarred by the housing market once. I mean, they remember what happened during the financial crisis. Those were their formative years. So I think that's something to consider too, as you think about, how younger Americans defined their path to wealth. I mean, maybe some of them don't want to go in that direction because they've seen how it could go wrong. And that's not to say that, the housing affordability crisis isn't a crisis. It certainly is. But I think you have to, view this issue within a wider lens. And I think it's fascinating. In terms of reasons to be optimistic, I mean, if you're a homeowner, for example, I mean, you're probably sitting on the better side of this trade. But, we're in an interesting point where a lot of homeowners have that 3% mortgage, have that 4% mortgage, and they don't feel like they can move. And unfortunately, if mortgage rates don't fall back down to 3 or 4%, then the case for moving isn't as obvious and as financially available as it was. I mean, also, if you're an American and you feel like you can't afford a roof over your head, that's a problem. But we have two presidential candidates who are talking about solutions to the housing crisis. There's a lot of conversation around it. So I want to say that we're moving in the right direction. We're tapping the ship. The ship takes a while to turn around, but it is good that we're talking about this, and there are, other ways to build wealth, other ways to, find your own American dream.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Callie. Where can people find your newsletter?
Yeah, so my newsletter is Optimistically. You can find it on Beehive under the Compound Media. It's optimistically.com. I'm generally a very optimistic person. This was probably one of the lower vibe things I wrote, but I think it's important to talk about. I think it's important to talk about the housing crisis. We all experience it in different ways, and it's going to be, one of the main talking points for years to come now. So look me up on Beehive, Optimistically. You can find me on Twitter at Callie A. Bost, and I post on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Callie.